And welcome. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Fantastic. Yes, I just want to say thank you very much for coming to this evening's program. It's a cold and it's a dark evening, and it's wonderful to see your faces here. Just before we start, just to introduce myself, my name is Lynne Buchanan, and I'm a student of the Brahma Kumaris. I've been a student for 17 years. And my job this evening is to actually help to take you through the process of this evening's program for the next 90 minutes or so. Okay, so before we start, let's just spend 1 minute in silence. And it's a way of just bringing yourself to center. It's just really being present to being here. Thank you. Okay, so can I have a show of hands for those of you who are here for the first time this evening? Show of hands, quite a few of you. Okay, so in which case I'll just tell you a brief account of who the Brahma Kumaris is. The Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University teaches Raj Yoga meditation to enable individuals to achieve peace of mind and to create a better outlook on life, just to really be able to experience life in a much more positive way. What we also do is we provide an opportunity for religious organizations and cultural groups, so really it encompasses everyone, to explore their own spirituality. And in doing so, they learn to reflect and to meditate. And that's based on the philosophy of Raj Yoga meditation that helps them to really be able to experience inner calm, clear thinking, and to have a more general well-being. In fact, the main aim of the Brahma Kumaris is to create world peace, but the way in which we do that is through creating peace within ourselves, and it's self-transformation, of course. And what we do within that is to be able to emerge those qualities and virtues which are innate to the true non-physical self and bring those out into action. So it's just a very short description of how we aim to create world peace through self-transformation. The other thing I want to say about the Brahma Kumaris is that internationally, we operate in about 100 countries and through about 8,500 centers throughout the world. In the UK, we work with the public in terms of working with voluntary sector organizations and public sector organizations, as well as community groups, in such areas as interreligious dialogues, working with the young people, youth programs. We work with the prison service, we work with the health service, as well as social care, and many other organizations. The Brahma Kumaris was established in the 30s in India, and it's currently based its headquarters is currently based in Mount Abu, India. And in terms of the Brahma Kumaris in the UK, We're a charity, and we were set up in 1975. And as such, we provide courses and programs and facilities for people free of charge, which means that we cover our costs through voluntary contributions from the public. It's true to say that we're here to serve the world, and we do so in the best way possible. Okay, so the next thing that I need to mention is that it's basically about the outline of the program. So we're here to talk about beyond fear. And for me, it's about going beyond fear. And what does it mean for me as an individual? I feel it speaks to me very, very clearly in terms of the times that we're living in at the moment. And it's a particular point in our human experience when there are lots of things happening that actually trigger fear and discontent within us. And it's actually interesting. I was actually thinking about this program, and I was thinking it's interesting that it's linked with the occurrence we had in the incident that occurred in Paris last week. Because that has created international uproar, and people are very distressed about what is happening. So, in fact, what I want to do is just refer to two quotes without actually going on too much. Two quotes in the flyers that actually brought you here. And the first quote is by Marie Curie, and she says, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand, more so that we may fear less." And the next quote I want to refer to is by Marianne Williamson, "As we are liberated from our fears, our presence automatically liberates others." So this evening will give us the opportunity to really question ourselves, look at ourselves about what's really in the way, and to become courageous. Now, what I'd like to do is like to ask people to switch your mobiles off and just to really be present and give yourself this space, because I understand quite a lot of you have come from far and wide. I've just spoken to one individual who's come all the way from, is it Croydon or Crystal Palace? Herne Hill. That's a long way. And she's come on her own. So thank you, Mary, for coming. So please, if you could just switch off your mobiles. And as you do that, I'd like to ask you just to spend a few minutes reflecting on the reasons why you're here. So just take some time to go inside. And in your inner reflections, just ask yourself, why have I come here tonight? And what do I hope to get from this program? Why do I come here tonight? And what do I hope to get from this program? Just spend a minute or so just being with yourself, allowing yourself to experience the response that you get from your inner self. Thank you. And what I'd now like to do is to ask you to share with one other, preferably somebody you don't know, just what came up for you in this process. Spend a minute and a half each way. Okay, I think we need to move on somewhat. So thank you very much. I'm not going to ask you to share what you've shared. It's just basically for your information. The next thing I want to do is just to mention about the program, how the program is going to unfold this evening. And first of all, I think it's really important to say that we're really, really very privileged and delighted to have a lineup of really wonderful, hand-picked speakers with us. And I will introduce them one by one when it's time for them to come on stage. But just to tell you what the logistics will be. So I will invite each speaker up onto the stage, and they will speak for 15 minutes, after which I will thank them and they will leave the stage, and that's how it will take place until the last speaker has spoken. Then I will invite all three people back onto the stage, and then there will be a discussion for about 20 minutes or so, followed by question and answers. So you will have an opportunity to participate in a practical way in the conversation. So what else do I need to say here? And then, of course, there'll be question and answers. So now I'd like to introduce, before I start inviting the speakers up, I'd like to introduce Aaron, who will be reading a poem from the book Seeking Silence. And after he's read the poem, we will have a minute's silence before we start having the speakers on board. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a book by Anthony Strano. It's entitled Seeking Silence. And the excerpt is entitled Moving Towards Silence. When we find silence, it becomes our breath. And when we use it effectively, it brings newness and direction to life. Silence conquers the tyrants of habit that oppress, suppress, and deceive us. Silence opens our eyes and ears to see and understand. And thus, we can overcome all tyranny, because the power of silence gives us the motivation and the will to become free. Through silence, we can transform confusion into clarity, anxiety into trust, blame into responsibility, and bitterness into forgiveness. The alchemy of silence is unlimited.
And now, I'd like to introduce Paul Palmerosa. And Paul is a tutor in philosophy in the School of Economic Science. He's the co-author for Principles to Profit, which is a book that he has actually brought and will be downstairs on sale. And he has authored a newly released book called In the Praise of Silence, which speaks quite loudly in terms of the passage which was just read Paul is currently director of If I Can, CIC, which is a not-for-profit organization offering a digital-based presentation of values for the youth in classrooms and in the boardroom. And there's something else which I actually took from the internet last night about Paul. He has had a meditation practice for 36 years and has also taught meditation. So without further ado, Paul, can I please invite you onto the stage? Thank you very much.
Om Shanti. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I feel very honored to have been invited. And there's two important subjects that we'll be exploring together: fear and silence. And I'll be offering you some of my own observations, my personal observations on these two. Now, fear, in my view in the world, is more prominent than silence. But you might ask, what is fear? Well, fear is a painful emotional response to something that is imagined is going to happen in the future. When you think about it, fear is always about something that might happen in the future. Now, the fear could be prompted by something in the past, like what happened in Paris, but the mind has a way of creating these scenarios that cause us tension and stress. I mean, how many of us have had thoughts of concern about the possible terrorist attacks here in this country? And the mind can play a lot of tricks on us, and that's one of the things we have to look. If we're going to be free from fear, we have to see the kind of maneuverings of the mind to bring it about. Now, beyond the fear of physical violence, we all have our own set of personal fears. I'll take one. The fear of failure. Anyone here experienced that? I certainly have, having been brought up in America. And as I reached my teenage years in the 1950s and 60s, on one hand in America, you had unlimited opportunity. Anything was possible. You had this open feeling of. At the same time, I realized that I was operating in a very competitive environment. Competition on all quarters. You had to get good marks in school. You had to win in sports. You had to be popular. Losing came to mean you were less of a person. So a fear of failure, a fear of losing, it was something that affected you. Now, I gradually saw that along with this strong desire to win, you also saw how the mind started to have a tendency to cover up your failings, focus on the faults of others, just very subtly make excuses or rationalize so you wouldn't have to suffer. So the mind was covering it over. It wasn't helping free one. And so this is one of the examples I found of the subtle workings of the mind that undermined our true being. But then I received two important gifts, my teenage years. One of them was the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And it was such an inspiration, I stuck it up on the wall, and because this showed, this beautiful poem, about the human values, that if you live them, that would be the way to be a man, my son. And one of the verses which stuck with me the whole time was, if you can treat triumph and disaster, those two impostors, just the same. Now, this fear of failure, this disaster to lose, was beginning to be seen as an imposter, something I shouldn't respond to. And it was a very helpful guide. In fact, it has become a further inspiration. Mentioned If I Can. We adapted If You Can to If I Can. It's a book on values, including silence being one of the key values. And we're introducing it into schools as well, because the children, it's better if they understand this when they're young. Now, the other gift I received was that when I was about 18, my uncle said, would you accompany me on a silent retreat, a weekend retreat being held in the local Jesuit monastery? So I thought, yes, I'll go along with him, I'll accompany him, do him a favor. And what I eventually came to see was that was one of the most valuable gifts I've ever been given. Now, if you can picture this, for a weekend, 100 American men, silent. Can you see that? It's quite a challenge. But what I discovered on that weekend was the power of silence to bring about clarity of the mind, finer sense perceptions, and a sense of peace and contentment. It was quite remarkable. And it made such an impression that for the next 12 years, we carried on every year. My uncle and I would have our weekend of silence. So I was in university at the time, then stepped out into business. And being able to refer to that silence, not just in the weekend, but during the year, helped me make better decisions, helped me communicate better, and opened my eyes more to more spiritual study. I really wanted to go in that direction. And on these retreats, I discovered that the combination of silence and good company, like we have here, made it a very good opportunity for a period of self-examination. So what I attended to do is to write down my observations about how the year had progressed. And what I was very interested to see was how it flowed so naturally with the silence. When you came to a silent state, the thoughts flowed very naturally. And there was clarity, and it enabled me to acknowledge both the good and the not so good aspects of my behavior in a year. And it was the honesty and natural humility that just flowed. It surprised me. And as a result of this experience over the years, I became a convert, if you will, to the power of silence. It's as if I saw the light, but it was very strong. I then, before my 30th birthday, I moved to Brussels. The company sent me to Brussels, to a whole new world, didn't know language, didn't know anything. It didn't matter. I was able to just face it. And I was fortunate enough to meet a School of Practical Philosophy, which is a branch of the School of Economic Science here in London, which was founded in 1937. And that school provides a wealth of spiritual, cultural, practical teachings from both East and West. And so my spiritual education was widening. Now, part of the study program for this School of Philosophy are weekend and week retreats. But they're not in silence, but you have ample time for quiet reflection, and most importantly, meditation, which is the practice par excellence for bringing you to real silence and stillness within. It's very important. Now, on one of the sessions we had in our study, we were looking at the Bhagavad Gita, this Indian scripture, beautiful scripture. And in chapter 16, they introduce the godly qualities, the qualities of the human being, of all of us. Unfortunately, those qualities are often covered over. But the first quality, the very first, is fearlessness, abhaya. One needs to be able to step out into the unknown fearlessly. And this is in practical cases, or if on a spiritual path, you need to be able to step out into the unknown and be fearless. When I moved here to London 35 years ago, I joined the school and have continued taking classes. And in recent years, they've introduced a week-long silent retreat. And I'm a regular attendee of that. It is a highlight of my year, because when you spend a week in silence with like-minded souls, you reach a state of stillness and quiet that it's almost beyond words. You're not putting names on things. You're not thinking about the past and memories. You're not imagining what might happen or what you'd like to happen or expect to happen. You're just present, still. You're a witness of it all. It's a real experience of unity. And you don't make judgments. You start to see the things that you often are spending time with, making judgments, making likes and dislikes. And on the level of activity on these weeks, this is my experience now with this silence, activities such as study just seems to flow. Wordless communications between people happens quite naturally. The heart opens and you do what's needed. Your attention is there and you do what's needed. There's no fear there. And that is like the story of this young prince whose father passed away and left the kingdom to him. Now this kingdom was under the dominance of a great monster that dominated and the movement and the control of people. And one day the prince was standing in the center of the town with the people, and the monster appeared. And the people gasped and ran back. And as they did that, the monster appeared larger. Now the prince was still. He didn't move. And he noticed that as they moved back, the monster grew larger. So he came still. And he took one small step into the unknown. And he noted the monster got smaller. And he started walking towards it, step by step. And it got smaller and smaller, until it was a small, insignificant object at his feet. And he picked it up. And he said, "Who are you?" And a meek voice said, "I'm fear." And he threw it aside. There was no more fear then. It took the fearlessness. It took the courage to go ahead. So, I can heartily recommend that we introduce more silence in our lives. And with that silence will come the clarity, will come the strength, the courage, and the intelligence to know how to deal with it. Now, I'd just like to finish now with a few quotes that have come from this book on praise of silence, from different traditions. One who keeps silence will be rewarded with salvation. Mohammed. We're not very much into silence in Judaism, but I do spend a lot of time listening to God in silence. Very honest. We need to find God, and He cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is a friend of silence. Silence is the true friend that never betrays. Speech is of time, silence is of eternity. Silence is a source of great strength. Now here's a series from the head of the Brahma Kumaris. It's a series of 3. And it is when we silence the chattering of our mind that we can truly hear what is in our heart and find the still, clear purity that lies within the soul. Spiritual love carries us into the silence of our original state of being. This silence contains the power to create harmony in all relationships and the sweetness to sustain them. And it is when I am silent within that I can let God into my heart and mind, filling me with peace, love, and power. In silence, a man can most readily preserve his integrity. Now, I thought you might want to have a more up-to-date one. The most boring thing in the world? Silence, says Justin Timberlake. That reflects part of the common attitude about silence. Mahatma Gandhi, silence is both a physical and spiritual necessity for me. I thought that was very... It is the attitude of silence, in the attitude of silence, the soul finds the path in a clearer light, and what is elusive and deceptive resolves itself into crystal clearness. In silence, relating to God becomes more than thought, dialogue, or contractual bargaining. It's not the mind moving. And 2 more. Spiritual study in solitude, combined with regular entering into silence, properly conducted, will develop that truth, that consciousness, whereby the sins, sorrows, thoughts of body and bodily fears will fall off as a scab when the wound is healed. When the mind is still and quiet, the totality and completeness of life is experienced. And then there is true freedom, peace, and bliss. And the person who dares to be silent, there's the courage, can come to experience that which is unhindered by experience, craving, or prejudice. When they are absent, there is nothing but love and reason, which are still and silent. And finally, he who is indifferent to blame or praise, triumph and disaster, those 2 impostors, who is silent, content with anything, without attachment, steady-minded and full of devotion. This man is dear to me. So, thank you very much.
For reminding us that when we focus on silence, fear turns into a little tiny, minute ball. Thank you. For me, that's what your lecture told me. Thank you so much indeed. And now let's spend a minute in silence before the next speaker is invited onto the stage. Thank you. And now I'm very excited to invite Lynne McTaggart onto the stage. Lynne, thank you for coming. And what I need to say about Lynne as an introduction is that she's a highly regarded and influential author. She's an investigative journalist, lecturer, and broadcaster whose work has been described as a bridge between science and spirituality. Voted Spiritual Writer of the Year in 2013, Kindred Spirits Awards, Annual Awards, Lynne is the author of a number of best-selling books, including The Bond and The Intention Experiment. And just something else that I've tacked onto your introduction, Lynne, it's in Wikipedia. According to your author, she's saying you are a spokesperson on consciousness, the new physics, and the practices of conventional and alternative medicine. So I'd like to invite you up onto the stage. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
It's so nice to be back here. This is one of my favorite places. And I just have to apologize because I have a bad cold. So I will try not to snuffle. Thank you very much while I'm speaking. So my little conversation today is going to be about silence and also when not to be silent. So I want to start by talking about how we all feel at the moment and how fearful we all are. Next slide, please. Russell Brand threw out a challenge for all of us a bit more than a year ago when he guest editored The New Statesman, and his publication was all about revolution in consciousness. And this is what he said. Next slide, please. In the pursuit of profit, we have forgotten that while individual interests are being met, we as a whole are being annihilated. We have become prisoners of comfort in the absence of meaning. And there's a very simple way of saying that. Next slide. It can be embodied in 4 words. The leitmotif of our lives, which is, I win, you lose. And that's pretty much engulfs and encompasses everything about our reality right now, our political life, our economic life. It's all about competitive individualism. Next slide, please. So for all of us, I think we need to shift it down a little bit so you can see the words. But basically, all of us feel like mice at the moment. And our inner conversation with ourselves is all about, well, what can little I do? So I want to talk to you about how powerful you are within and how you can harness that power and in silence for change. Next slide, please. How you can all become mice that roar. And it's all about finding what about you is a master influencer. Next slide, please. I study cutting-edge science and cutting-edge physics. And the late Fritz Albert Popp, a physicist in Germany, discovered something pretty amazing. He discovered that human beings, and in fact all living things, sent out a tiny current of light all the time. We are beaming out to the world at every moment. Next slide, please. And what this really means is that we're communicating. We're a bit like a television station and a television set all the time. In Popp's studies, he discovered that when living things sent out this light, other living things sent back light synchronicitously. And our thoughts are not encapsulated inside our heads as we think. Next slide. So what this really indicates, just hit it again, please, is that you're sending and receiving at every moment. Next slide, please. And of course, the big question is, your messages are being heard and replied to. So, next slide, please. What are you actually sending? What is it that is being broadcast? Every single one of us are leaky buckets, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you in a few moments. So the big question is, what is it you are transmitting with your thoughts? You know, most people, when they think about the power of your thoughts, the power of intention, think about the idea that you have a power thought in the morning with your morning meditation. You have that power of thought, you think about what you want, you think about how the day is going to go, and they feel that that's all the universe hears. And you can go about your day for the rest of the time, but the universe will hear that intention, that power of thought. But as I say, you're a leaky bucket. You are sending and transmitting at every moment. Every last judgment you have, every negative thought you have about yourself or someone else, all that flotsam and jetsam that runs through your head, every last mendacious thought, that also gets beamed out to the world, and that essentially becomes your life's intention. So one of the things that I talk about is the idea of starting to become mindful of what it is that you are transmitting at every moment. And that is the power of your own silence, the power of harnessing what it is you are thinking. Next slide, please. So one of the things to do in terms of conquering fear is changing the conversation from inside to out. What you translate and transmit to the world. And this is something that I've been studying quite a lot because I've done an entire book on the power of intention, and I run an ongoing experiment, which I'll get to in a moment. Next slide, please. What I've discovered is that the studies demonstrate that your thoughts are one of the most powerful tools you have. There have been many, many studies of the power of intention in very prestigious laboratories around the world, Princeton University, University of Arizona, many places, and they've all demonstrated, next slide please, that a thought isn't just a thing, but a thought is a thing that affects other things. And there have been some remarkable studies. For instance, Princeton University ran an entire program for some 30 years testing the power of thoughts to affect sensitive electronic equipment. They would set up a computer that was programmed to show randomly two different images, let's say cowboys and Indians, and it would be randomly programmed so that it would show up cowboys about 50% of the time and Indians about 50% of the time. And that's how it would run when left to its own devices. So then what they would do is put an operator in front of this computer and have the operator send an intention to have more cowboys than Indians. And over hundreds of thousands of studies, they found a small but persistent deviation from chance, meaning that when people wanted cowboys, a good percentage of them got cowboys, more cowboys than Indians. So these studies together demonstrated a huge, huge significance that our thoughts can affect this very sensitive equipment. Now, they went on to other types of studies, looking at many, many scientists have done this, looking at the power of thoughts to affect everything from single-celled organisms to full-fledged human beings. Next slide, please. And one of the most remarkable studies, looking at the power of thoughts to affect reality, there's a kind of flashing lights going on here. I don't know, maybe I'm affecting the lights with my thoughts. It doesn't like me, or maybe it does. Maybe it just wants to highlight what I'm talking about. I don't know. Is there anybody up there in the control room who can fix that red light that's flashing on me all the time? So, one of the most remarkable studies of the power of thoughts had to do with a thing called the love study. And in this study, they wanted to see what would happen if they took a pair, in most cases a husband and wife, where one of them had cancer. What would happen if the other partner sent intention to heal that person's cancer? So this lab, which was the Institute of Noetic Sciences, took these two, this pair in each instance, and they had many couples. And they would put the ill partner in one room with a camera on him or her. They would take the well person and put him or her in another room and have a monitor in front of them. And every so often, the person with the monitor would see his loved one or her loved one's image flash up on the computer screen. At that moment, they were supposed to send a loving intention to heal them. And what the scientists had done is hook them up to all kinds of equipment, measuring their physiological processes. So they had things to measure their heart rate, their breathing, etc. So when they analyzed this, and they had many, many couples doing this, an amazing thing happened. They discovered that when the party sent intention to the ill partner, their heart rates started working in unison. Their breathing became synchronized. Their skin conductance, the rate at which the blood goes to their extremities, also became synchronized. Their brain waves, everything. It was like two bodies had become one. That's how powerful our thoughts are. So when I saw all of this information, I was really intrigued by it. And I thought, okay, well, that's really interesting about the power of individual intention. But what happens when lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? Next slide, please. I was really fascinated by whether or not there is a power in small and large groups. Next slide. Now, I'd been really influenced by studies by the Transcendental Meditation Organization, which demonstrated in these studies that when a certain mass of meditators were in any particular area, the crime rate went down. And also the misery index fell, that is unemployment, traffic accidents, that kind of thing. And so I was really intrigued by this, and I thought, okay, well, that's when people are doing a passive exercise. What happens if they're actively thinking a thought at the same time? The same thought at the same time. Does that magnify the effect? Will it work even more? So I started looking, and I couldn't find any studies that examined this. So my husband, who has lots of great ideas, and I'm the mug who usually has to carry them out, turned to me and said, well, why don't you carry out these studies yourself? And that seemed pretty preposterous to me because I'm not a scientist, I'm just an author. But when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, I've got readers in 30 countries around the world, and I also know lots of scientists from the books that I've done about science and spirituality. So if I put them together, I'm going to have the biggest global laboratory in the world. So that's what I did. I started running intention experiments, next slide please, where I would invite my readers to come on my website, and we would set up an experiment somewhere in a well-controlled study, somewhere in some scientist's lab. Many of them were carried out at the University of Arizona. And we ran many experiments on little targets like leaves and seeds. We did a series of 12 studies looking at whether or not we could send intention to make seeds grow faster with our thoughts. And in every case, I was interested in philanthropic ideas because I wasn't interested in ideas like, there have been many, many books written about the power of manifestation, getting more stuff. More stuff, a new job, a bigger car, all of that stuff. I was interested in the idea that if our thoughts are so powerful, can we use them to heal the world? So we did a lot of studies also trying to purify water. And we had significant effects. We've run 27 experiments thus far, and 23 have demonstrated positive, mostly significant effects. And they've always been analyzed by a team of scientists. So one of the most intriguing series of studies we did was to take a giant leap to see if our collective intention could lower violence in a war-torn area. Next slide, please. So we chose Sri Lanka in 2008 because that was a place no one was really thinking about. And it had a 25 year civil war. So for 8 days, me and my audience of people from something like 70 countries around the world gathered together on our website and sent intention to lower violence in a particular area of Sri Lanka that was controlled by the rebels. So what happened during that week was really extraordinary. First of all, after the week, the deaths and injuries plummeted. And this was one of those places, it took me a long time to find one, where organizations were accurately counting the casualties, the deaths and the injuries. And we also had a team of scientists looking at a timeline to look at what had happened, to model then what should happen if things followed according to plan. So, as you can see, death rate fell by 74%, injuries by 48%. But another weird thing happened. During that 8 days, the government, which had been miserably losing the war, wrested control, had a couple of decisive battles, wrested control of the North in 3 more months. And in 4 more months after this, that 25-year civil war was over. So it ended in a bloodbath. It wasn't wonderful, but it was done. One of the bloodiest, longest civil wars in the world was done. Did we do this? Who knows? You do one of these, and it could be pure coincidence. So we ran one again. Next slide. In 2011, I partnered with a guy who's like the Deepak Chopra of the Middle East. And he has many, many Muslim followers. And we decided that for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we didn't want to see those twin towers coming down again. So we partnered for peace, and we ran a giant experiment to lower violence in 2 southern provinces in Afghanistan. And we had people from 85, 90 countries around the world coming together, Muslims in every one of the Muslim states, plus Westerners and people around the globe, sending intention. And afterward, after months of trying, I finally wrested the figures out of a German general from NATO. We discovered some remarkable things. Attacks in the southwest, just where we were sending intention, fell extraordinarily. And to 790%. So much so that they were remarked upon in a special report compared to all the other areas of Afghanistan. And we were targeting the Taliban strongholds. Did we do this? You know, you do it twice, it could still be coincidence. Next slide, please. So we ran 2 experiments, sending intention to probably the most violent place in America, the US Congress. So we sent intention to the whole area of Washington, D.C. that surrounded the Congress, that county, and a county next to it. And we did this twice in 2011, June and September. And when we modeled it, we discovered that violent crime had been going up. But as soon as we sent intention, it decreased by 33%, and it carried on. Even though property crime continued to go up, we were focusing on violent crime. Did we do this? But next slide. One thing that I found was really fascinating of all, and by the way, right after we did one of our experiments, John Boehner, who is Speaker of the House, and Nancy Pelosi, who was former Speaker, one a Republican, the other Democrat, sworn enemies, hugged the next day. So we thought maybe we had this effect. Next slide, please. So the most remarkable thing of all was not just what was happening out there in the world, but what was happening to my participants. Over and over, they reported an extraordinary palpable sense of oneness, and their lives changed. They talked about healings in their relationships, healings in their lives, healings in their physical situation, changing their jobs, working for peace. Something big had changed. Next slide. And when I started running small intention experiments in workshops of 8 or 12, the same thing happened. We'd run an intention to send healing to one member of a little group, and everybody in the group would get better. Now, I'm going to have you experience this for just 1 minute, because I want you to feel this power of group silence and how important it can be. So will you just hold hands, please? We're just going to create a little kind of intention group. And while you imagine, when I play some music, I'd like you just to hold an intention to move beyond fear into the power of group silence. So just hold that intention. Next slide, please, while we play this, just for a short minute. Okay, next slide. Should be music on this. Just feel the connection with the rest of the people in the group. And just hold that intention. Just feel it amplifying in the power of this group. Just feel that palpable sense of oneness. I can feel it up here. And in your own time, come back into the room. I'm sorry, I think they're having some difficulties with the sound, but did you feel that? Raise your hand if you did. Imagine using that to heal someone in a small group. Imagine making an intention to heal something in your neighborhood. Imagine using that to raise the grade point average of the children in your schools. Imagine using that on a daily basis with a group that you feel close to, that becomes your spiritual connection. Now, before I finish, I also want to talk about when it's important not to stay silent. Next slide, please. And this is about galvanizing your community and galvanizing against fear and for freedom. So I have a lot of experience with this over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. Because besides these books I write, I've also edit with my husband a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You. And as you can imagine from that title, it's slightly controversial in that it looks critically at certain aspects of conventional medicine that haven't been demonstrated to be, effective or safe. And it also looks at evidence for alternative medicine. So it's broadly speaking in favor of non-drug-based medicine. It's very critical of the pharmaceutical industry and it exposes many lies. So we started turning this, which had been running for as a newsletter, into a magazine 2 years ago. And from the moment we did, a group of pharmaceutically backed skeptic organizations, lobbyists, started trying to get our magazine off the shelves. And they wrote to our distributors. They had a gang of people hiding the magazines. They messed up our search engine optimization from our website. They tried everything. Next slide. And it culminated in a story that they planted, essentially. Next slide, please. In the Times, calling to ban the magazine, right? And so it carried on. And they also did staged campaigns to get us out of the stores, including places like Tesco and W.H. Smith. And Tesco finally caved in and pulled us off the shelves. So we realized that this was a really important moment because we couldn't get the Times to correct that story, and pretty much everything besides the and end was a lie. They would not correct it. There was a great deal of suppression of information. So the only way we could talk about it was on the internet. So we started Facebooking about it. We started writing on our Facebook pages about what journalism should be and that it shouldn't be placed stories by pharmaceutically led organizations. It shouldn't be corporate interests. It should be about a fourth estate, a guardian of the truth, a guardian of the people. So we started doing that. And we also, next slide please, told our people about it on Facebook, and they started doing things like this and sending it round. It went crazily viral. Tesco caved and put us back in. And, and next slide please. And we ended up winning Website of the Year from the popular vote. So what I discovered is that there are times not to stay silent. Before I leave you, I just want to talk a little bit about what I do, and then I want to leave you with one thought. Next slide, please. Please check out my books. These are basically a trilogy: The Bond, The Intention Experiment, The Bond, my latest book, which I'll be selling today, and the book that started me on this path, The Field, all about science and spirituality, the power of your thoughts, and also the power of taking this new science into the community. Next slide, please. And what doctors don't tell you, we're selling it everywhere but W.H. Smith's, which are out at the moment, but we've got a nice campaign going, and if you'd like to write customer service and tell them they ought to stock us too, that Je suis Charlie, remind them that freedom of speech is really important. Next slide, please. And I just want to tell you about my husband's book, new book, The Untrue Story of You, which is a fantastic book about how to let go of the past and live in the present and it's a fantastic model of why the past inhabits you like an unwanted guest. Next slide, please. This is where to find me on Facebook. Next slide, please. And it's pretty lively these days with what's going on with the people trying to ban us. And that's my website. So I have one more thing to say. Does the music work? Music does not work. Okay, I'm going to show the images while I talk to you. Next slide, please. Let's see if they work. Yeah. There was a poem in World War II that was written around the time saying, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, but there was no one left to speak out for me. I think that there's a really important point where we shouldn't stay silent. And one of the things I want to really remind you of right now is the importance of not just spiritual inner inquiry, but spiritual activism. At a point where we are threatened with many, many removals of our freedoms, whether it's freedom of speech, freedom in healthcare, as we see, many, many freedoms. You have so much more power than you think, not just individually, but collectively. That power starts from within, it starts from your thoughts, but it also continues on from your actions. If you don't believe that, let me tell you the story of Marie. Marie was just an ordinary person like you or me, in an office with a typical dog-eat-dog attitude there. And she said to herself, what can I do to change this culture? And she said, well, I'm not very big here, but I could leave change in the Coke machine with a little sign that says, your Coke's been paid for. Keep the spirit alive and pay it forward. This completely freaked out all of her coworkers. They began a spy network around the Coke machine to find out who the secret Santa was. So Marie upped her game. She moved it up to the next floor and started leaving donuts. Same sign. This has been paid for. Keep the spirit alive, pay it forward. It became the discussion of many, many lunches, and it became the single inciting incident that totally changed the culture in that office. Now, there are many, many other things that we can all do. We're a really, really important generation, probably the most important generation that ever lived, because we sit on a precipice of what has gone on before and what is dying and what is trying to be born. And all of us have to take that position of becoming a spiritual activist, whether it becomes from within or from without. And I believe there are many, many things we can do. Don't just vote with your ballot this spring. Vote with your heart. Vote with your purse. Vote with and choose what you want to see in the world, and use the power of the group. A small group can turn into the most potent force for change. But the important point is to make it come from within and to understand how powerful you really are, how necessary it is to change, and how important it is to just come to one thought, which is, it doesn't have to be this way, not for one more day. So please leave here tonight and ask one single question. What will your contribution be? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynne. You reminded us of the power of thought, which starts with the individual, and how when that expands into a group consciousness, the impact that can have on individuals and the world. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so another minute of silence, please. And now, I would like to introduce Sister Jayanti. I've known Sister Jayanti for 17 years, and I would say that she is my distant mentor as well as somebody that I have close to hand in case I need to have a conversation. She has been my teacher really over the past 17 years, and very much provides me with the tools and the things I need to actually grow as an individual. Sister Jayanti is the European Director of the Brahma Kumaris, and she's the author of many spiritual books. And you will have heard her voices in a number of different meditation audio visuals. She is also an international speaker, and she's a teacher, and she presents in a very, very deep and impacting way. And she presents with a lot of authority because there's a lot of knowledge that is based on what she's actually saying. Her life has been spent working for world peace. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite Sister Jayanti onto the stage.
Om Shanti. It's been a real joy to hear Paul and now Lynne, and I really appreciated all the things that you've shared. I want to share with you a story, and it's a real story. And it's appropriate that we're having this program in the month of January. And maybe it's because it's the month of January that I'm inspired to share this story. It's the story of one man, and one man who decided that it was time to go beyond fear and beyond all limits and use the power of silence in his own life. This was in 1936. It was in a place called Hyderabad in Sindh in Pakistan. Today it's Pakistan. And this man had a vision of a better world. And part of his vision was that it would be through the power of purity that the world could be transformed and peace could come into the world. At that time, he didn't know too much about how it was going to happen. He had this vision of a beautiful world ahead, and after that vision, he was left with a question. this voice told me that I had to be an instrument to create a better world. But he didn't tell me how. And then it took the rest of his lifetime, another 33 years, in which he gradually understood how. And the how was that it would be through spiritual knowledge, spiritual education, and part of that would be that it would be through women that these teachings would be shared, so that there could be more of a balance achieved in the world. Because until then, or even today in the world, it was very much the male that was a dominant force, and especially in the 30s, at that time in the subcontinent, it was a situation of being second-class people, not even citizens, but just second-class people. And it was quite a revolutionary idea, but deeply spiritual at its core, because at its core was the awareness of justice and equality, and going beyond all the fears that exist in both sides, men and women. And as a result of that vision, at that time, a group of around 300 people gathered together, and the majority of them were women. And can you imagine a woman, 21 years old, brought up in a very, very orthodox way, and yet at that moment, literally, a mouse became a tiger. Those who knew her, and this is Daddy Janki's story now. The earlier part of the story was the story of the man, Dada Lekraj, who then took on the role of Brahma Baba. But this woman, 21 years old, she had the courage to face the whole of society at that moment, together with all the others in the organization. But her story I know intimately. And they told her, but you've got no education. She had 3 years of schooling. You've had no financial background of your own, nothing that could give you independence. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? But she decided that her life was to be one of spirituality, and she was not afraid. And today she is 99, and yesterday morning I left her in Ahmedabad, and she still had a couple of doctor's appointments, but she made the journey back again to Abu, the place where we have our headquarters. And today, speaking to her on the phone, her voice was strong. And a woman who's faced death that I know of at least 10 times, at least. Because regularly, from the time I've known her since I was a child of 8, I've seen her go through huge, huge trauma in terms of physical health. And it's okay. It's a challenge that's come and it's a challenge that's gone, and she's moved on with a lot of courage and power and continue to serve. And the reason why I'm here today is because 2 days ago she said to me, "You don't have to stay with me in India anymore. I'm fine." And she wasn't at that time, but she said, "I will be fine. I am fine. I will be fine. You just go ahead." And I share her story because it truly is a story of the power of silence, enabling her to go beyond any fear, fear of death, fear of human beings, fear of repercussions, fear of anything, and come to this point where she, not just she would always say it's the one above, but on a very human, physical level, she's been an instrument to share that message in over 100 countries and enable literally hundreds of thousands of people to transform their lives and become spiritual activists. the teachings that she shares are the teachings that she heard through this man who had that first vision. And those teachings are, firstly, the awareness of who I truly am. And for each one of us, it's a lifetime's journey, which seems strange. Surely I know who I am. Of course I know who I am. And yet, in fact, I don't. Until I go on that inner journey of silence and discover both the power that is good within the self, but also the things that are not so good, that I can take help from above and be able to transform them and come back to that original innate sense of goodness that I carry within myself. The knowledge of the self, the knowledge of the divine, being able to make that link with the divine. We read a lesson every morning, and each day's lesson is very powerful. And it's the same lesson that's read across the world on the same day, obviously different times for the time zones, but the same day, the same date, we share the same lesson, and so the power of collective thought is something that we're very, very aware of, because we're all then thinking about the same subject. And one particular sentence struck me this morning, and that was about the power of silence. And it stated that the power of silence is the power of yoga. And yoga in this context means the union with the divine. So when I, in the awareness of the spiritual being that I am, the soul, connect with the divine, the supreme, then in that union, in that connection, there is the experience of the power of silence. And we use the power of thoughts, the power of the mind, to bring us to that stage where there can be that connection in which there's a silence, in which there is no more need for any words. It's a state of being, a state of experience. And so I'm very aware that the power of silence is the power with which one is able to go not only beyond fear, but beyond any other negative force that may exist, but also beyond the limits that we set our own selves. I'm sure you'd believe me if I told you that when I started my spiritual journey until that point, I could not have spoken to 2 people. If it was 2 people, fine. More than 2 people, 3 people, and I'd be silent. I wouldn't speak. And the transformation of being able to speak to 500 people, that was my initiation by fire, to speak in front of 500 people. It happened literally overnight. One day I couldn't, and the next day I could. And it happened simply because I was told one thing: just come back to the consciousness of the inner being. Come back to the awareness of who you are, and see others with that same awareness. Don't see the bodies, don't see the different colors, just see the shining star that's there in their forehead. And for any of you who have a fear of public speaking, I recommend the same. Just that. Just be here and see others in that same way, and there's no more fear. But Dadi's lesson of literally going beyond the fear of death has been an amazing lesson for me to observe. And then, to whatever extent, practice that consciousness myself. Maybe death is the biggest fear that we all face, and maybe those who are sitting here have already been able to understand that it's possible to transcend that fear and not allow it to impede you in any way at all. But I remember that when I had that first experience of I, the inner being, the soul, being eternal, I, the soul, separate from the body, and I have an existence which is eternal, no beginning, no end. I exist, and I exist forever, beyond time. And in that experience, there was absolutely no fear. And so, come back to that awareness again and again. And certainly there's no fear of illness and no fear of death. Because I know that illness has come to the body, but in that state of detachment from the body, I'm able to give that power from above to this body, to be able to heal it and deal with whatever it is that it's going through. Sometimes just detach and not even think about the process of healing. But in that state of detachment, then the soul's able to gain power. And in that power, there's a greater capacity with which to be able to tolerate whatever is the pain that the body may be experiencing, but also the power to be able to heal the body. I'm not saying don't go to your doctor. I'm sure Lynne wouldn't say that either. I'm not saying don't seek professional advice, but there's lots of things that we can do for ourselves that are absolutely independent of all these external things. And so the power of silence, I think really it is the ultimate power with which we can transform ourselves, but also it's the power with which we're able to transform the world. Many, many years ago, in 1968, when I decided that this was to be my life and this was to be my journey, Brahma Baba said to me, I was fortunate, I met him many times as a child and a teenager, and this was in his last year in the physical world before he moved into the subtle dimension. And at that time, June 1968, he said to me, it's possible to have a world free from sorrow, a world free from hunger, a world free from illness. All of that is possible. But it can only happen if lust, anger, greed, attachment, and ego have been removed from the world. And from a spiritual perspective, I could understand that completely. And my heart accepted what he was saying. Over the years, and more in recent times, I've come to accept that it's not just a spiritual understanding of how things work, but in a very practical way. It's only when we've been able to deal with anger and greed and ego and attachment that all the ills of the world can be finished. There is no other way until that happens. But the other part of that message he was sharing was, you can't tell somebody else that they have to remove their ego and anger. What you have to do is do it yourself. And if you do it yourself, then yes, that can create a wave that can bring about transformation and inspiration for others to do the same. And so the slogan that we use is, when I change, the world can change also. And I believe that that is absolutely true. And I want to second Lynne's message for tonight, that the time is now. It's not tomorrow, it's not later, But that moment of transition, that moment when the dark night finishes and the dawn breaks, I don't think it's going to happen. I believe that it's happened already. I believe that we are in that period in which the dawn has already broken and the light is here in the world, and it's just up to us to be awake and be aware of that light and benefit from that light and experience that transformation ourselves and just see the amazing wonder and the magic of the transformation that's happening in the world around us. If we choose, we look at the darkness, but if we decide to look at the light and be the light, then we're able to bring about a better world. And I believe that it's this period of time which is the most important period in human history, in which transition is actually happening at this very moment. I'm honored that we've had such wonderful people who shared with us in such a beautiful way, and so it's been very easy for me to share with you this message. Thank you.
Hello. My question is the word spiritual, or the words spiritual and spirituality, are very mysterious and elusive. I don't know if you could get 4 people to agree on what they mean. So I'd like for you to comment, because I would like to know a clearer understanding in myself as to what spiritual means.
Have a go? All right. Well, when you look at yourself and anyone else, you have some physical elements, you have some mental elements, you have some emotional elements. And we all know about those and can feel them. And what is said is that there's another aspect in our being, the being of ourself and in everyone else, that's beyond words and beyond the mind. It's another dimension. You can't define it. I mean, it's the reason why I think spirituality can be difficult to understand, because the mind wants to grasp it and find a definition on it. But there's something beyond that. And all the religions, all the philosophies speak about that. And you can, and evidently the human being is the only being who can actually experience it. This self, this soul. And I think that's the realm. And I can understand the difficulty in trying to define it and put words on it, but that's what I would say.
For me, it is everything but well, let me say it another way. Science today basically is about materialism. That is the override of most scientific interpretation, that the human being is not very much more than a lot of electrical firings and chemical signaling. But there has been a sense through time of a something more. And the human being has been obsessed, in a sense, with this need to search for that something more, that miraculous, has a sense of shock and awe all the time, not only when witnessing the universe, but when witnessing within. And I think it is that search, that need to connect with something bigger than this small sense, the smaller sense of ourselves, that is within all of us, and is why so many cultures, so many civilizations have needed to create a religion, because they've needed to understand that sense of awe. They've needed to connect with something bigger. I don't think that it is some imaginings or it is culturally imposed. I think we have some innate desire and innate need to understand something larger.
just in a way to confirm and accept all the things that have been shared. And to me, that which is associated with the inner being, the soul, is that which is spiritual. And in that awareness of soul, then I'm in contact with my own inner core values, and I have the possibility of experiencing the presence of the divine. And in the state in the physical, then I'm disconnected with my core values, and we have the result of materialism in its gross, rampant form that we see today. And so time to come back to the inner being and the core values of the spirit and spiritual.
It's great to hear examples of the healing God. There was one presentation of God, he's all powerful, he can do anything. And when you see suffering and there's no healing, you hear people time and time again saying, why does God not heal? So I think it's marvellous to hear examples of the healing God, the caring God, the healing God. And I would like to see him presented more often, the God who heals. Could you give one or two examples of him? I experienced the healing God myself, but it's great to hear him presented. Could you do that, please?
That for me, there's the awareness of God having masculine and feminine qualities, because I don't see God as a form, but just that being. And in that being, there are the qualities of the compassionate mother, the merciful mother, the loving mother that doesn't hold anything of the past, so that there's unconditional love. And so my experience is that even when there's been mistakes that I've made, yet God's love doesn't cut itself away from me, but it's still available for me. And God's power at that moment is able to heal the soul and transform it so that the mistakes can be finished and I can move forward. And so that's a very practical way in which I've experienced the healing power of God.
I think for me, I very much experience God as not separate from me. I feel that God is within all of us, and certainly there have been references to Jesus talking about, about the God within all of us. And so for me, my interpretation of God is that we are all connected. Certainly that's the new science that's coming through, is that on a very fundamental level, we are all connected through our subatomic being. And so for me, that experience is about unity. So it's not about good God or bad God, it's about connectedness. And that sense is very much, if I feel very connected, I feel with God.
Yes, I would share that. I think that the question of the connection, the analogy I like the best is the sun is covered with clouds and you don't see the sun. But you take away the clouds and there the sun is, and it's always been shining, but it's just covered over. And I think that's the way we are. We cover over with the mind and ideas, the attachments, the ego. And the work that seems to have happened in this life is a work of just taking away the covers. It says that the wind brings the clouds to cover the sun, but the wind can also push away the clouds to reveal the sun. And that wind is our mind. And our mind has been the cause of a lot of these covers. But when it's still, when it's really still, it knows quite clearly, and then the covers start to go away and reveal our true self, And then there's all these qualities that they speak of the good God, forgiveness and happiness and peace and compassion. It's natural. It's part of all of us.
So there's one other person over there, and I think that will be the last person. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you, the three of you. It's been a wonderful evening. I would like to ask you something. I have lived with HIV for 33 years, and I'm lucky to still be alive. I wonder how I can reflect my positiveness into people who live with stigma and fear due to illness. What advice would you give me to deal with the people who are my clients and the people that I work with?
Well, I mean, you're a living example of it. And I think leading by example is just, a fantastic way to do it. I mean, I think back to Princess Diana, who made that first leap of touching people with AIDS to show this is not contagious, in this sense. I won't catch it, and hugging them and things like that. And that kind of experience of you breaking the boundaries and demonstrating that, I think could be very healing to them. And then spreading that message in the community also, and inviting them to be ambassadors to share that in the community is also a powerful way of self-healing, in my view.
Yes, I think that the question of example is very important. And that's what people need to see. They especially need to see it in leaders. And they're not seeing it today, and that's one of the big problems. And if people in their quiet way, without any claims, now this is the tricky part, because you do something and all too often the ego slips in there and says, oh, my, that's not very good. Nice one, That has to be left aside. And with that giving and good example, I think it will have its effect. And you've described some of the subtle effects that good intention can have.
There was something I heard a long time ago from a doctor who also does a lot of other types of healing practices. And he said that one of the things that can create strength in the immune system is hope. And so if you can offer hope through your own example to others, then that definitely is putting them on the right track.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I just want to thank the speakers for a wide variety of perspectives and really very deep and very thought-provoking information about going beyond fear. So I want to thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you very much for the valuable contribution that you've made.